"I can't control myself when I see your curves," he told the virgin bride that was sold to him. The dusty saloon fell silent as the young bride was pushed forward, sold like a sack of grain to the highest bidder. A giant mountain man threw down silver, and with one shocking line, claimed her before the jeering crowd. But when he carried her out beneath the church bell's toll, something unexpected began. He wasn't the brute everyone feared. In the lamplight of his lonely cabin, he offered protection instead of shame. Yet in the shadows, a powerful cattle baron whispered of contracts, debts, and a claim that could tear them apart. As storms raged and a chapel burned, the outcast and the bride stood against a world that wanted to break them. But secrets from the past and a fight for land and dignity threatened everything they'd built. Would love and faith be strong enough to protect her from the man who swore she was his property? Or would the West devour her innocence before it could blossom into hope? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The night air bit cold against Amelia's skin as she perched stiffly atop Noel Boone's horse. Her fingers clutched the worn leather reins, knuckles white with tension. The saloon's raucous laughter still echoed in her ears, mixed with the jingling of silver coins that had sealed her fate. Her father hadn't even looked back as Noel led her away. The horse's steady hoofbeats marked their slow progress down the darkened road. Shadows from scraggly pine trees stretched across their path, cast by a thin sliver of moon. Noel's heavy coat, draped around her shoulders, smelled of leather and wood smoke. It was the only kindness he'd shown since his crude words in the saloon. "Mind your balance there," Noel's gruff voice came from beside the horse. His boots crunched steadily in the dirt as he led them onward. "Trail gets rougher ahead." Amelia said nothing. The Bible clutched to her chest was her only comfort, its familiar leather binding pressed against her heart like an old friend. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. Not here. Not now. The sounds of the mining town faded behind them. Only the night birds called now, their mournful cries floating through the darkness. The horse stumbled slightly on loose rocks, making Amelia grab the saddle horn. "Steady now," Noel murmured, but Amelia couldn't tell if he was talking to her or the horse. Her mind wandered back to the saloon, to the moment that had changed everything. The tobacco smoke had hung thick in the air as her father, 3 days into a losing streak, had dragged her inside. His eyes had been wild, desperate. The smell of cheap whiskey had rolled off him in waves. "Got something special to offer," he'd bellowed, yanking her forward. "My girl here needs a husband. Who'll give me a fair price?" The miners had laughed, crude suggestions flying. Amelia had wanted to sink through the floor, disappear into the rough wooden boards. Instead, she'd gripped her Bible tighter and prayed. Then Noel had stepped forward, his scarred face half hidden in shadow. The room had gone quiet at the sight of him. Everyone knew the ex-Army scout, knew the whispered stories about his past. He'd pulled out a heavy leather pouch that clinked with promise. "This enough?" he'd asked, voice low and steady. Her father's eyes had lit up at the sight of silver, but the crowd wasn't satisfied. "What you want with her, Boone?" someone had called. "Ain't your usual type?" That's when he'd said it, the words that had made her cheeks burn. "I can't control myself when I see your curves." The saloon had erupted in laughter, but Amelia had caught something in his eyes then, a flicker of gentleness, almost apologetic, before it vanished behind his usual stern mask. Now, as they traveled further into the wilderness, Amelia studied his broad back in the darkness. He moved with the sure-footed grace of a man used to hard country. The moonlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and the old scar that ran from temple to jaw threw shadows across his face. "How much further?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About 3 miles yet," he answered without turning. "Homestead's up in the foothills. 3 more miles of uncertainty. 3 more miles to wonder what kind of man would buy a stranger for a bride. 3 more miles to pray for strength." The trail began to climb, winding through stands of pine and oak. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, and Amelia pulled Noel's coat tighter around her shoulders. Her legs ached from the unfamiliar position in the saddle. A coyote's yip echoed from somewhere in the darkness, making her jump. The horse snorted but kept its steady pace. "Don't fret," Noel said. "They won't come near us." His voice was gentler than it had been in the saloon, but Amelia couldn't forget how he'd humiliated her there. Even if his eyes had held something kinder, his words had cut deep. The moon climbed higher as they continued their journey. Wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine sap and sage. Amelia's thoughts drifted to her mother, gone these 5 years now. What would she think of her daughter's situation, sold by her own father to a scarred stranger with a mysterious past? "There's a stream ahead," Noel broke into her thoughts. "We'll rest the horse a spell." True to his word, Amelia soon heard the gurgle of running water. Noel helped her down from the saddle, his hands strong but careful at her waist. Her legs trembled as they touched the ground. The stream ran clear and cold over smooth rocks. Noel led the horse to drink while Amelia sank onto a fallen log, still clutching her Bible. She watched as he moved efficiently, checking the horse's legs and adjusting the saddle. "Might as well drink too," he said, offering her a battered tin cup he'd filled from the stream. "Still got a ways to go." Amelia accepted it wordlessly, the water cool and sweet on her tongue. When she finished, she noticed Noel watching her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "What you said in the saloon," she began, forcing the words past her dry throat. "Was that necessary?" Noel was quiet for a long moment. The stream's gentle music filled the silence between them. Finally, he sighed, a heavy sound full of weariness. "And no," he admitted. "It wasn't. But those men in there, they needed to think they knew my intentions. Made it easier to get you out." "And what are your intentions?" Amelia asked, her voice stronger now. "To give you a proper home," he said simply. "Nothing more or less than that." Something in his tone made Amelia look up sharply, but his face was turned away, focused on adjusting the horse's bridle. "Why?" she pressed. "Why would you spend so much silver on a stranger?" Noel's hand stilled on the leather straps. "Because no person should be sold like cattle," he said quietly. "And because I've seen what happens to young women left to the mercy of mining camps." His words hung in the night air between them. Amelia studied him, trying to reconcile this man with the one who had shocked the saloon with his crude remark. Which was the real Noel Boone? "We should move on," he said, breaking the moment. "Moon's good for traveling." He helped her back into the saddle, his movements efficient but careful not to frighten her. As they resumed their journey, Amelia felt something shift inside her. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first seed of understanding. The trail grew steeper, switching back and forth across the hillside. Pine trees pressed close on either side, their branches reaching like dark fingers across the path. Noel's boots scraped steadily against stone as he led them higher. "Watch your head there," he warned as they passed under a low-hanging branch. The concern in his voice seemed genuine, making Amelia wonder again about the contradiction of this man. The wind carried new scents now, wood smoke and livestock. They must be nearing his homestead. Amelia's heart began to beat faster. What would she find there? What kind of life awaited her? "Almost home," Noel said, as if reading her thoughts. He glanced back at her, his scarred face softened by moonlight. "You'll be safe there. You have my word on that." Amelia nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Her Bible pressed against her chest like a shield, but for the first time since leaving the saloon, she felt its presence as comfort rather than protection. They rounded a final bend in the trail, and Amelia caught her first glimpse of Noel Boone's home. A small cabin sat in a natural clearing, its windows dark but solid-looking. A barn stood off to one side, and a corral held several horses that lifted their heads at their approach. It wasn't much, but it was far from the rough mining camp they'd left behind. There were signs of care here, a neat wood pile, well-maintained fences, even what looked like a small garden plot. Noel helped her down from the horse for the last time that night. Her legs shook with exhaustion, and she stumbled slightly. His hand caught her elbow, steadying her. "Easy now," he murmured. "Been a long night." Amelia found herself looking up into his face, trying to read the truth there. In the moonlight, his scar looked less fearsome, more like a mark of survival than violence. His eyes met hers steadily, and she saw again that flicker of gentleness she'd glimpsed in the saloon. "Thank you," she whispered, surprising herself. "For getting me out of there." Noel's expression softened further. "You're welcome, Miss Amelia," he said quietly. "Now let's get you inside where it's warm." As he led her toward the cabin door, Amelia felt the weight of the night's events settle fully on her shoulders. She was here, for better or worse, at the mercy of this mysterious man. But something told her that Noel Boone's mercy might run deeper than his scars would suggest. The cabin door creaked open, and Amelia May stepped into her new life, still holding her Bible close, still uncertain of what tomorrow would bring, but no longer quite as afraid as she had been in that smoke-filled saloon. The mountain trail wound ever upward as dawn's first light began to peek over the eastern horizon. Amelia's body ached from hours in the saddle, every muscle protesting the unfamiliar position. Noel's horse plodded steadily onward, its hooves finding sure purchase on the rocky path despite the dim light. The night had stretched endlessly, filled with the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Now, as gray light filtered through the trees, Amelia could no longer contain the question that had burned in her throat since leaving the saloon. She swallowed hard, gathering her courage. "Are you going to hurt me?" Noel's broad shoulders stiffened ahead of her. He kept walking, leading the horse, but his voice came back soft and clear in the pre-dawn stillness. "No, Miss Amelia. You're safe with me, I give you my word on that." He maintained his distance as they continued climbing, refusing to touch her beyond what was necessary to help her mount and dismount when they rested the horse. His restraint spoke louder than words, though Amelia's heart still fluttered with uncertainty whenever he drew near. The sun had fully crested the mountains when they finally rounded a bend, and Noel's cabin came into view. It was larger than Amelia had expected, a sturdy structure of squared logs with a proper stone chimney. Smoke curled from it in a lazy spiral, suggesting someone had banked the fire before Noel left for town. "Home," Noel said simply, leading them into a cleared yard surrounded by split-rail fencing. Amelia's legs trembled as he helped her down from the horse. She stood unsteadily, watching as he efficiently unsaddled the animal and turned it into a corral with several others. The homestead spoke of careful maintenance. Neat wood piles stacked against the cabin walls, well-swept paths, tools properly stored. Inside the cabin was plain but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a cast-iron cooking stove sat cold in the corner. Noel immediately set about lighting it, his huge hands surprisingly deft with the kindling and matches. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a solid wooden chair at the table. "You must be hungry." Amelia sank into the chair, still clutching her Bible. She watched as Noel moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency. He pulled a quilt from a chest and draped it over her shoulders, a beautiful piece made of worn calico squares, obviously cherished. "Was my wife's," he said quietly, turning back to the stove. "Ayoka made it herself." The name hung in the air between them as Noel set about warming beans and slicing bread. Amelia drew the quilt closer, feeling the weight of history in its stitches. She studied her unexpected protector as he worked. His hands were massive, scarred from years of hard work, yet they moved with surprising gentleness as he prepared their simple meal. His eyes remained guarded, but she caught glimpses of something deeper, a profound loneliness that seemed to seep into the very walls of the cabin. It was there in the single chair by the hearth, the carefully preserved quilt, the way his gaze sometimes drifted to empty corners as if seeing ghosts. When he set a plate before her, the beans steaming and the bread thick-sliced, Amelia's stomach growled loudly. She hadn't realized how hungry she was. Noel's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile as he took a seat across from her. They ate in silence, but it wasn't entirely uncomfortable. When Amelia finished, she folded her hands and whispered a prayer of thanks, both for the food and for whatever providence had led this strange man to intervene in that saloon. "You'll take the bed," Noel said as he cleared their plates. "I'll sleep in the chair." Amelia wanted to protest. It was his home after all, but exhaustion had settled into her bones like lead. The bed looked impossibly inviting with its clean sheets and patchwork quilts. She was too tired even to weep over the strange turn her life had taken. She watched through heavy-lidded eyes as Noel settled into the chair by the hearth, his long legs stretched toward the dying fire. Within moments, her own eyes closed, and she drifted into dreamless sleep. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the sound of splitting wood. Amelia woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. The events of the previous day crashed back into her memory, and she sat up quickly. The cabin was empty, but she could hear Noel working outside. She smoothed her wrinkled dress as best she could and stepped to the window. He was at the chopping block, his powerful shoulders flexing as he swung the axe. Each stroke sent another piece of wood flying. Amelia opened the cabin door hesitantly, testing this new reality. The mountain air was crisp and clean, so different from the smoke-filled mining camp. Noel paused in his work, watching as she ventured onto the porch. "Morning," he said, driving the axe into the chopping block. "Sleep well?" She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "Yes, thank you." "Need to tend to the livestock," he said, wiping his brow. "You're welcome to come along, or stay here. Whatever suits you." Amelia surprised herself by following him to the barn. She watched as he moved from stall to stall, feeding and watering the animals with careful attention to each one's needs. A pair of milk cows, several chickens scratching in the yard, the horses in the corral. It was a proper working homestead. As morning wore on, Amelia found herself studying Noel with growing confusion. He treated her with quiet dignity, keeping his distance while ensuring she was comfortable. He could have treated her as property. That's what she was, legally, having been purchased with his silver. Instead, he showed her nothing but respect. "Why?" she finally asked as he carried fresh water to the chicken coop. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Noel set down the water bucket, considering his answer carefully. "Because every soul deserves kindness," he said at last, "and because I know what it's like to be judged without cause." His hand drifted unconsciously to the scar on his face, and Amelia felt understanding begin to dawn. This man, who looked so fearsome at first glance, had known his share of prejudice and pain. Yet he had chosen to show mercy when he found her in distress. As she watched him return to his chores, something shifted in Amelia's heart. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her since the saloon began to loosen its hold. This was not the future she had imagined for herself, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was hope to be found here on this mountain homestead with this quiet, honorable man. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and drying the dew from the grass. Chickens scratched in the yard, horses nickered in the corral, and the smoke from the cabin's chimney rose straight and true against the blue sky. It was a peaceful scene, so at odds with the chaos and desperation of the previous night. Amelia found herself drawing deeper breaths, her shoulders relaxing incrementally as she watched Noel go about his work. He moved with purpose, each task flowing naturally into the next, creating a rhythm to the day that spoke of long-established routine. There was something comforting in that stability, something that whispered of safety and permanence. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and sage, so different from the stale tobacco and whiskey that had permeated the saloon. Here, in the clear light of day, Amelia began to see her situation with new eyes. Noel Boone might have bought her with silver, but he was offering her something far more valuable than mere shelter. He was offering her dignity. The morning sun climbed higher as Amelia stood by the well, her hands gripping the rope attached to the wooden bucket. She pulled, muscles straining against the weight of the water. The rough hemp bit into her soft palms, unused to such labor. By the third haul, angry red blisters had formed at the base of her fingers. Noel noticed her wincing as she tried to lift another bucket. He approached quietly, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Here," he said, his voice gentle. "Let me show you." He demonstrated how to wrap the rope around her forearm, using the strength of her whole body instead of just her hands. "Like this," he explained, guiding her movements. "Let your weight do the work." His huge hands dwarfed hers as he adjusted her grip, but his touch remained careful, respectful. Amelia tried again, following his instruction. The bucket rose more easily this time, water sloshing against the wooden sides. "Thank you," she said softly, surprised by his patience. She had expected harsh words or impatience at her inexperience, but Noel simply nodded and continued his own chores nearby, keeping a watchful eye in case she needed help again. As the day wore on, Amelia found herself settling into the rhythm of homestead life. She gathered eggs from the henhouse, careful not to startle the clucking hens. She swept the cabin's wooden floor and aired out quilts in the mountain breeze. Each task, though foreign to her hands, felt purposeful. When evening approached, Amelia prepared a simple supper from the supplies in Noel's pantry. Beans again, but she found some dried herbs to add flavor, and the bread was fresh enough to toast over the fire. They ate in the growing darkness, the cabin lit by a single oil lamp. The question that had burned in her mind all day finally found its way to her lips. "Why did you buy me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Noel set down his fork, considering her question. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his scarred face. "Couldn't stand to see you sold to worse men," he admitted after a long moment. His words held truth, but Amelia sensed there was more he wasn't saying. After supper, while Noel stepped out to check the livestock one final time, Amelia found herself drawn to explore the cabin more thoroughly. The main room was sparse but tidy, with a few pieces of sturdy furniture. A trunk beneath the window caught her eye. It wasn't locked, and her curiosity overcame her hesitation. Inside, she found carefully folded clothing, and beneath them, a beautifully beaded leather pouch. The intricate pattern spoke of skilled hands and patient hours. Beside it lay a pair of faded moccasins, their leather soft with wear. These must have belonged to Ayoka, Noel's late wife. The sound of boots on the porch made Amelia start. She turned to find Noel watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have pried." Noel's jaw tightened, but he didn't seem angry. Instead, a deep sadness settled over his features. "Those were Ahyoka's," he said, moving to stand beside the trunk. His fingers brushed the beadwork reverently. She was Apache. Made these herself. "The town," he continued, his voice roughening. "They despised me for loving her. Called me a traitor to my own kind." His hand clenched into a fist. Didn't matter that she was the finest woman I'd ever known. All they saw was that she was Indian. Amelia watched the play of emotions across his face, grief, anger, and underneath it all, a love that still burned. She thought about the courage it must have taken to honor that marriage in the face of such hatred. To choose love over acceptance, to stand firm when the whole world stood against you. "She sounds remarkable," Amelia said softly. Noel nodded, carefully closing the trunk. "She was—" The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. Amelia slipped outside, needing air and space to process what she'd learned. The evening was settling over the mountains, painting the sky in deep purples and fading gold. She made her way to the corral where Noel's horses grazed in the twilight. Leaning against the rough-hewn fence, Amelia found herself humming an old hymn. The familiar melody brought comfort as she watched the horses move in the gathering dusk. One approached, nickering softly, and she reached out to stroke its velvety nose. From the barn came the sounds of Noel at work, the rustle of hay, the clank of metal buckets, the ordinary sounds of ending another day. Amelia's voice grew stronger as she moved from humming to quietly singing the hymn's words about grace and redemption. The wide sky above seemed to catch and hold her voice, carrying it across the homestead. She felt smaller here beneath that vast expanse, but somehow safer too. The terror of the saloon seemed distant, though uncertainty about her future remained. What place could she find here in this man's home with the ghost of his great love lingering in every corner? Later, as full darkness settled, they sat across from each other at the table. Noel had made coffee, its rich aroma filling the cabin. The silence between them felt different now, no longer weighted with fear and suspicion, but something closer to understanding. Amelia wrapped her hands around the warm cup, studying the man across from her. The lamplight softened his scars, illuminating instead the gentle way he held his cup, the careful consideration in his eyes. She saw now what she'd missed before. The depth of his capacity for love, proven by his marriage to Ayoka, and the well of loneliness her death had left behind. She thought about how he had appeared in that saloon, offering silver to save a stranger. Perhaps it hadn't been just about protecting her from worse men. Perhaps he had recognized something in her situation. The helplessness, the judgment of others, the need for someone to stand up and do what was right, no matter the cost. The coffee's warmth seeped into her blistered hands as they sat in companionable quiet. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, its voice echoing off the mountains. The sound reminded Amelia of just how far she was from the life she had known. Yet here in this moment with this complex and honorable man, she felt the first real stirrings of peace since her father had forced her into that saloon. Noel rose to add wood to the fire, his movements careful and deliberate. The flames caught and grew, pushing back the darkness, warming the room. Amelia watched him settle back into his chair, noting how he positioned himself and to keep her in sight while maintaining a respectful distance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more blisters, more discoveries about this place and the man who had brought her here. But for now, in the gentle glow of lamp and firelight, Amelia let herself simply be present in this moment of quiet understanding. The morning sun streamed through the cabin windows as Amelia surveyed Noel's modest kitchen. 2 days had passed since she'd discovered Ahioka's belongings, and she felt it was time she contributed more to their shared meals. The pantry held basic supplies, flour, lard, beans, and a few dried herbs. She'd watched her mother make biscuits countless times, though she'd never attempted them herself. Determination set her jaw as she mixed the flour and lard with shaking fingers. The dough felt wrong, too sticky, then too dry as she added more flour. Still, she pressed on, shaping uneven circles and placing them in the cast-iron skillet. While the biscuits baked, she turned her attention to the beans. The pot bubbled on the stove, but no matter how she seasoned them, they refused to thicken properly. The smell of scorching drew her attention back to the biscuits, and she yanked the skillet from the oven with a gasp. Noel returned from his morning chores just as she was setting the table. Her cheeks burned as she placed the misshapen biscuits beside the watery beans. The bottom of each biscuit was black as coal, while the tops remained pale and doughy. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook," she admitted, unable to meet his eyes. Noel sat down at the table, his expression neutral. He picked up a biscuit, examining it carefully before taking a generous bite. "Reckon these ain't half bad for a first try," he said, though she could see him struggling not to grin. "They're terrible," Amelia protested. "You don't have to pretend." "Well now," he said, dipping the burned biscuit into the thin bean liquid. "I've eaten worse on the trail. At least there ain't no sand in these." The absurdity of the situation, her disastrous cooking, his valiant attempt to be polite, suddenly struck her. A giggle escaped before she could stop it, then another, until she was laughing outright. The sound echoed in the cabin, bright and unexpected. Noel's eyes widened at her laughter, then softened. His own chuckle joined hers, deep and rusty, as if he too had forgotten the sound of his own mirth. "I'll do better next time," she promised, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. "I know you will," he said simply, and continued eating the burned biscuit as if it were the finest fare. After their memorable breakfast, Noel led Amelia to the barn. A spotted cow stood in one of the stalls, udder heavy with milk. "Time you learned some proper chores," he said, positioning a 3-legged stool beside the animal. Amelia approached cautiously. The cow turned its head to study her with large, liquid eyes. "She's gentle," Noel assured her. "Name's Daisy." He demonstrated the milking technique, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy. "Like this, see? Firm, but careful." Amelia settled onto the stool, trying to mirror his movements. Her first attempts were clumsy, barely producing a thin stream of milk. The cow shifted, restless at her inexperienced touch. "Easy now," Noel murmured, though whether to her or the cow Amelia wasn't sure. He knelt beside her, adjusting her grip. "There. Let your hands remember the rhythm." Gradually, Amelia found the proper motion. The sound of milk hitting the pail became stronger, more steady. Pride swelled in her chest at this small victory. "Well done," Noel said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Next lesson's even more important." He led her back to the cabin and returned with a Winchester rifle. Amelia stepped back instinctively, but Noel's expression was serious. "Out here, you need to know how to protect yourself, whether from wolves or worse." His instruction was methodical, stern, but never harsh. "Always keep the barrel pointed down," he emphasized, demonstrating the proper grip. Check the chamber every time you pick it up, even if you know it's empty. Amelia listened intently, absorbing every detail. The weapon felt heavy and awkward in her hands, but Noel was patient, adjusting her stance and grip until she held it properly. "We'll practice shooting another day," he said, watching as she carefully worked the lever action. "For now, just learn how it feels. How to hold it safe." As evening approached, dark clouds gathered over the mountains. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters and bending the tall grass. Noel hurried to secure the livestock while Amelia brought in extra firewood, stacking it neatly by the hearth. The storm broke just as they finished their preparations. Rain drummed against the roof as lightning split the sky, followed by rolling thunder. Inside, the cabin felt snug and secure. Amelia sat in her usual chair, listening to the wild weather while Noel stoked the fire. "Thank you," she said softly, watching the flames dance. Noel glanced up from the hearth. "What for?" "You're patient, teaching me things, eating those awful biscuits without complaint." She smiled at the memory of breakfast. He settled into his own chair, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Been a while since I had company," he admitted. "Forgot how it was, having someone else around." A particularly loud crack of thunder shook the cabin. Amelia jumped, her hand flying to her throat. Without hesitation, Noel reached across the space between them, his large hand settling warm and steady on her shoulder. "Just thunder," he said quietly. "We're safe here." The weight of his hand anchored her, calming her racing heart. Neither of them spoke about the contact, but something shifted in that moment, a trust taking root, as natural as the rain soaking the earth outside. They sat in comfortable silence as the storm raged on, listening to the interplay of wind and rain, thunder and crackling fire. The lamplight cast their shadows on the wall, two figures sharing the same space, no longer strangers, but not quite friends. Something in between, still finding its shape. When the storm began to ease, Amelia knelt beside her bed as she did each night. But instead of her usual silent prayers, she spoke aloud, her voice clear in the rain-washed quiet. "Dear Lord," she began, "grant me strength for whatever lies ahead. Thank you for this shelter, for these lessons in living, for—" She paused briefly. "For bringing me to a place where I might learn to be useful. Amen." From his chair by the fire, Noel had bowed his head at her first words. He remained still, face shadowed, but Amelia saw something move across his features. Recognition, perhaps, or remembrance of other prayers spoken in this cabin long ago. The rain continued to fall gentler now, a soft percussion on the roof. Amelia climbed into bed, pulling Ahioka's quilt up to her chin. Across the room, Noel added another log to the fire, its light casting a protective glow throughout the cabin. That night, for the first time since leaving town, Amelia slept without fear, lulled by the dying storm and the steady presence of her unlikely guardian. In his chair by the fire, Noel kept watch, his expression thoughtful as he considered the changes one small laugh could bring to a quiet house. The morning sun cast long shadows across Noel's homestead as they prepared for the journey into town. Amelia adjusted her faded calico dress, grateful that the early autumn air remained crisp enough to justify wearing Noel's coat over her shoulders. The familiar scent of leather and pine needles gave her comfort as she watched him saddle the horses. "Supply run shouldn't take more than a few hours," Noel said, checking the cinch on his bay gelding. He helped Amelia mount the dappled mare he'd chosen for her, his hands steady and respectful. "Stay close once we're in town." The trail wound through stands of aspen trees, their leaves beginning to turn golden. Amelia found herself stealing glances at her companion as they rode. Noel sat his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, his scarred face alert but peaceful in the morning light. As they approached the town, the pleasant mood of their ride began to fade. The main street stretched before them, dusty and already busy with morning traffic. The moment they rode past the livery stable, Amelia felt the change. Conversation died away. Heads turned. Eyes followed their progress. "Well, if it ain't the scout and his bought bride," a voice drawled from the doorway of the saloon. The words carried clearly in the sudden quiet. Amelia's cheeks burned. She fixed her gaze on her horse's mane, trying to block out the whispers that seemed to follow them down the street. Bought and paid for me? Living in sin with that half-breed lover no better than she ought to be. Noel's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, guiding them toward the mercantile. He dismounted first, then helped Amelia down, positioning himself between her and the growing crowd of onlookers. The bell above the mercantile door chimed as they entered. Inside, the familiar smells of coffee, leather, and dried goods wrapped around them. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, barely looked up from his ledger as they approached the counter. "Need flour," Noel said quietly. "Coffee, too. And whatever else the lady requires." Amelia had just begun examining a bolt of sturdy cotton when the door opened again. Heavy bootsteps crossed the wooden floor, accompanied by the jingle of silver spurs. "Well now, what have we here?" The voice was smooth as creek ice and just as cold. Amelia turned to find a tall man in an expensive black coat studying them with pale eyes. His vest was embroidered silk, his watch chain gold, but there was nothing refined about the way he smiled. "Silas Ketchum," Noel said, his voice flat. "Didn't expect to see you in town so early. When I heard about your recent acquisition, I knew I had to pay a visit." Silas reached into his coat and withdrew a folded sheaf of papers. "We have a situation that needs addressing." Mr. Peterson suddenly found urgent business in the back room, leaving them alone in the store's front area. Amelia's hands began to tremble as she watched Silas spread the documents across the counter. "You see," Silas continued, "Miss May's father and I had certain arrangements. Business dealings, you might say. He owed me a considerable sum." His smile widened. "And as these papers clearly show, he offered his daughter as collateral against that debt." The room seemed to tilt beneath Amelia's feet. She grabbed the counter's edge to steady herself, her voice barely a whisper. "That's not possible." "I'm afraid it is, my dear." Silas tapped the papers with one manicured finger. "Your father's mark, right here. The debt transfers to me, along with all associated property and collateral, which means you, Miss May, legally belong to me." "She belongs to no one." Noel's voice cut through the air like a knife. "The law says different." Silas gathered the papers with deliberate care. "I've already spoken with Judge Matthews. He's quite clear on the matter. The contract is binding." Whispers drifted in from the street, faces pressed against the mercantile windows, drawn by the drama unfolding inside. Amelia felt the walls closing in, her breath coming in short gasps. "You can't just claim her like a stray cow," Noel growled. "Can't I?" Silas's smile never wavered. "I own half the water rights in this territory, the best grazing land, the minds of most men who matter. And now, it seems, I own the lovely Miss May." He turned to Amelia, extending his hand. "Come along, my dear. My house is far more suitable for a lady than some scout's cabin." Noel stepped between them, his massive frame blocking Silas's reach. "We're leaving. This isn't over, Boone." Silas's voice hardened. "Take her if you want for now. But remember, everything you think you own can be taken away. Everything." Noel's only response was to wrap one arm protectively around Amelia's shoulders, guiding her toward the door. The crowd outside parted before them, their faces a blur of judgment and curiosity. Amelia barely registered mounting her horse or leaving town. Her mind spun with Silas's words, with the horrible thought that she might still be nothing more than property to be traded between men. They were halfway home before she realized she was shaking. Noel pulled his horse alongside hers, his face etched with concern. "He can't really own me," Amelia said, hating how her voice quavered. "Can he?" "No man owns you," Noel said firmly. "Not even me." Amelia's hands tightened on the reins. "But you bought me. In the saloon. I paid your father's price to get you away from there. That don't make you my property." Noel's eyes met hers, serious and steady. "You're free to go whenever you choose. Always have been." His words both comforted and confused her. If she wasn't his property, what was she? A guest? A burden? Something else she couldn't name? The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin. Amelia moved through the familiar motions of preparing supper. grateful for the simple routine. She could feel Noel watching her as she set the table, his presence both reassuring and uncertain. "What are we going to do?" she finally asked, settling into her chair with a bowl of beans. Noel took his time answering, methodically breaking a piece of cornbread into smaller portions. Silas Ketchum is used to getting his way. Man like that, with money and influence, he'll try to use the law against us. "Against you, you mean?" Amelia stared into her bowl. "You don't have to fight this battle. If you let him take me." "No." The word came out like a gunshot, Noel's hands clenched on the table. "I won't surrender you to him. Not to any man who thinks he can own another person." "But why?" Amelia pressed. "Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" Noel was quiet for a long moment, watching the lamplight flicker across the cabin walls. When he spoke, his voice was soft but determined. "Because it's right. Because you deserve better than being traded like cattle. Because..." He hesitated, then continued. "Because I've seen what happens when good people stay silent in the face of wrong. Won't do it again." Amelia felt tears threatening and blinked them back. What if he's right about the law? Then we'll find another way. Noel's eyes met hers across the table. "I swear to you, Amelia May, you won't go to that man. Not while I draw breath." The conviction in his voice wrapped around her like a warm blanket. For the first time since leaving town, Amelia felt her trembling ease. She wasn't alone in this fight. Whatever came next, she had someone willing to stand beside her. They finished their meal in companionable silence, each lost in thought about the confrontation to come. Outside, a coyote called into the gathering night, its lonely song echoing across the hills. Inside the cabin, two people who had started as strangers found themselves united against a common enemy, their shared meal becoming something like a declaration of war. The days following Silas Ketchum's threat stretched like molasses, sweet with quiet moments but heavy with worry. Dawn brought the familiar crowing of roosters, and Amelia found comfort in the steady rhythm of homestead life. She rose early each morning, determined to prove her worth beyond being someone's property. In the coop, gathering eggs became a morning meditation. Amelia learned to move slowly, speaking softly to the hens as they clucked and shuffled. Her fingers grew sure at finding warm eggs tucked in the straw, and she took pride in returning to the cabin with her basketful. "You've got away with them birds," Noel observed one morning, watching her scatter feed. "They used to peck something fierce when I'd gather eggs." Amelia smiled, brushing straw from her apron. "They just need a gentle touch. Like most creatures, I reckon." The kitchen became her battlefield where she waged war against burned biscuits and lumpy gravy. Each failure taught her something new. Noel never complained, eating whatever she set before him with the same quiet gratitude. But the day she finally produced a perfectly golden loaf of bread, his eyes lit up with genuine pleasure. "Now that's something worth celebrating," he said, cutting thick slices while the loaf was still warm. They shared the bread with fresh butter, and Amelia felt a surge of belonging stronger than any she'd known before. Here, in this simple cabin, she wasn't the gambler's daughter or someone's property. She was just herself, learning and growing. During the long afternoons while bread rose or stew simmered, they began to talk more freely. Noel spoke of his army days, tracking parties through dangerous territory, learning the Apache ways of reading the land. "The officers thought they knew everything," he said, whittling a piece of wood as they sat in the shade. "But the Apache scouts taught me more in a month than I'd learned in 3 years of service. How to find water by watching birds. How to move silent as a shadow. How to respect the land instead of fighting it." His voice grew softer when he spoke of Ayoka, his Apache wife. "She saw past the scars, past what other folks thought of me. Taught me there's more than one way to see the world." In return, Amelia shared stories of her childhood, the brief happy years before her mother died and her father turned to gambling. "Mama taught me hymns," she said. "Said music was God's way of helping us pray when words weren't enough." "Will you sing one?" Noel asked quietly. Amelia hesitated, then began Amazing Grace in a clear, sweet voice. The melody floated across the yard, drawing even the chickens closer. When she finished, Noel's eyes were distant with memory. "Ahyoka used to sing too," he said. "Different songs, but same spirit. Music speaks truth no matter the language." Sunday dawned clear and cool. Noel saddled the horses early, surprising Amelia with news of a gathering. "Preacher Thompson comes through once a month," he explained. "Holds service in Miller's clearing. Thought you might want to attend." Amelia's heart leaped at the prospect of worship, though anxiety followed close behind. Will people mind? After everything that's happened? "Some might," Noel admitted. "But good folks know better than to judge without knowing the whole story." The clearing lay an hour's ride away, tucked between rolling hills. As they approached, Amelia saw wagons and horses gathered beneath tall pines. A canvas tarp had been strung between trees, creating shade for the congregation. What struck her most was the mix of people. Settler families in their Sunday best sat alongside Apache families in traditional dress. Children played together at the edges of the gathering, their laughter knowing no boundaries of culture. Several heads turned as Noel helped Amelia dismount. She felt the weight of curious stares, heard whispered conversations. But when she lifted her chin and walked beside Noel toward the congregation, she found strength in his steady presence. Preacher Thompson, a weather-beaten man with kind eyes, stood beneath the tarp. His Bible lay open on a rough-hewn podium, its pages fluttering in the breeze. As he began to speak, Amelia felt tears well in her eyes. How long had it been since she had heard scripture read aloud? "The Lord is my shepherd," the preacher's voice rang out. "I shall not want." The familiar words washed over her like rain on parched earth. Beside her, Noel stood silent but attentive, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Some of the settlers shot dark looks his way, but others nodded in greeting. The Apache families seemed to regard him with particular warmth, several making traditional gestures of welcome. When hymns were called for, Amelia's voice rose clear and true. She knew all the old songs by heart, and soon others joined in. The harmony of different voices, some singing in English, others in Apache, created something beautiful and new. After the service, families lingered to share news and food. Amelia found herself welcomed by several women who saw past gossip to her genuine nature. Sarah Miller, whose land they gathered on, pressed a jar of preserved peaches into her hands. "For your pantry," she said with a warm smile. "Every home needs something sweet." An elderly Apache woman approached, her face creased with wisdom. She spoke softly to Noel in her native tongue, then turned to Amelia with gentle eyes. Through Noel's translation, Amelia learned she had been Ahyoka's aunt. "She says you have a good spirit," Noel translated, "that you sing from the heart like her niece did." Amelia bowed her head in thanks, touching her heart in the gesture she'd seen others use. The old woman smiled and pressed something into her palm, a small pouch of dried herbs for tea. The ride home seemed shorter, filled with conversation about the morning's events. The sun hung low in the western sky by the time they reached the cabin, painting everything in gold. "I felt it today," Amelia said as they tended to the horses. "God's presence, for the first time since." She trailed off, remembering the smoke-filled saloon, her father's betrayal. "Since that night?" Noel asked quietly. She nodded. "I thought he'd abandoned me. But today, hearing those hymns, seeing people worship together despite their differences, it reminded me he's always there, even when we can't feel him." Noel was silent for a long moment, brushing his horse with steady strokes. "I envy that," he finally said. "Your faith. Lost mine somewhere between burying Ahyoka and watching good people suffer. But sometimes..." He looked up at the first evening star. "Sometimes I wonder if he ain't still there, waiting for me to find my way back." They stood together as darkness gathered, watching stars pierce the deep blue sky. The evening air carried the scent of pine and sage, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "You're stronger than you know," Noel said suddenly. "Most would have broken under what you've faced. But you keep finding beauty, keep trying to build something good." Amelia felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. Looking at the cabin, at the garden she'd started, at the man who'd given her safety without demands, she knew a truth that both frightened and thrilled her. "I want to stay," she whispered, "even with Silas Ketchum's threats hanging over us. Even if trouble comes. This feels like home. Noel didn't respond with words, but his hand found hers in the gathering dark. They stood together, watching the stars multiply across the vast sky. Two souls who'd found unexpected sanctuary in each other's company. Later, as Amelia prepared for bed, she heard Noel humming Amazing Grace as he checked the property one last time. The sound brought a smile to her lips and peace to her heart. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. Dawn painted the horizon in soft pinks and golds as Amelia stood at the wood stove, carefully tending to her morning's work. The kitchen filled with promising aromas, fresh cornbread browning in the cast-iron skillet, eggs sizzling just right, and coffee so dark it nearly matched the pan. She'd been practicing in secret, determined to master the art of frontier cooking. The floorboards creaked as Noel entered, drawn by the smell of breakfast. He paused in the doorway, surprised by the spread laid out on the rough-hewn table. Steam rose from the coffee pot, and the golden cornbread sat perfectly shaped on a plate. "Smells mighty fine," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. Amelia's hands trembled slightly as she slid the eggs onto a plate. "I hope it tastes as good as it smells. The cornbread's my third try this week." Noel settled into his chair, pouring coffee into his tin cup. He took a long sip, eyebrows rising in appreciation. Now that's proper coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. Color rose in Amelia's cheeks at the praise. She watched anxiously as he cut into the cornbread, remembering her previous attempts. One burned black, another heavy as a brick. But this time, the knife revealed a perfect golden crumb. "Well, I'll be," Noel said after his first bite. "You've got the touch now, sure enough." "Truly?" Amelia sat down across from him, her own plate modest. "Truth plain as sunrise," he gestured at the spread with his fork. "This here's as good as any I've had." "Much obliged, Amelia." They ate in comfortable silence, morning light streaming through the window. The routine of their days had fallen into place like pieces of a puzzle, neither of them speaking much about it, but both feeling the rightness of it. After breakfast, they tackled the day's chores together. Amelia gathered eggs while Noel repaired a loose board on the barn door. The morning passed in steady work, each of them moving around the other with growing familiarity. In the afternoon, Noel led Amelia to the corral where his spare horse, a gentle bay mare, waited. "Time you learn to ride proper," he said, adjusting the saddle. "Can't have you depending on me for transport forever." Amelia approached the horse cautiously. She'd never been this close to one before coming to the homestead. The mare's brown eyes regarded her calmly as Noel helped her mount. "Now hold the reins like this," his large hands covered hers, showing her the correct grip. "Not too tight. She needs to feel you trust her." The warmth of his touch sent a flutter through Amelia's stomach. She focused on his instructions, trying to sit straight in the saddle as he'd shown her. "That's it. Now give her a gentle kick to walk on." Amelia did as told, but the mare moved faster than expected. She lurched forward, losing her balance. "Oh!" Noel's strong arm caught her before she could slide off. "Easy there," he said, steadying her. "Try again." This time, Amelia managed to stay seated as the horse walked forward. Her initial fear gave way to excitement. "I'm doing it." "You sure are?" Noel's smile reached his eyes, softening the scar on his cheek. They practiced until sunset, Amelia growing more confident with each circle of the corral. When she finally dismounted, her legs wobbled like a newborn colt's. She caught herself against the fence, laughing at her own unsteadiness. "Land's sake, I feel like I'm walking on water." Noel chuckled, helping her regain her balance, "and you'll get used to it." "Did well for your first lesson." That evening found them by the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. Amelia sat in her usual chair, mending a tear in one of Noel's work shirts. Without thinking, she began to hum "Sweet Hour of Prayer," the melody rising and falling with the flicker of flames. Noel sat in his own chair, whittling a piece of wood, his hands stilled as she hummed, the knife going quiet. Amelia continued, her needle keeping time with the familiar tune. The peaceful moment wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Later that night, a cry pierced the darkness. Amelia woke instantly, her heart pounding. Another sound, Noel's voice, rough with anguish. "Ahyoka! No, Please." She hurried to his chair by the dying fire where he'd fallen asleep. His face was twisted in pain, hands clenched on the armrests. "Noel," she called softly, touching his shoulder. "Wake up, you're dreaming." His eyes flew open, wild with remembered grief. For a moment he seemed lost between past and present. Then recognition dawned, followed by shame. "I'm sorry," he muttered, trying to turn away. "Didn't mean to wake you." Amelia knelt beside his chair, taking one of his large hands in both of hers. "Don't apologize for missing her." The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Noel's fingers tightened around Amelia's. "I should have done more," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "When she fell sick, the town doctor, he wouldn't—" He broke off, swallowing hard. "By the time I got her to the Apache medicine woman, it was too late." "Oh, Noel." Amelia's heart ached for his pain. "Sometimes I think I'm cursed," he continued, "bringing darkness to those around me. Maybe that's why God took her. Punishment for crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed." "No." Amelia's voice was firm. She closed her eyes, letting prayer rise naturally to her lips. "Dear Lord, ease this good man's burden. Help him see that love, any love, comes from you. Let him feel your grace, your forgiveness, though he needs none. Show him he is not cursed, but blessed with a heart big enough to love across all boundaries." Silence fell after her words. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the night. Noel's breathing steadied, his hand relaxing in hers. "You remind me of her sometimes," he said softly. "Not in looks, but in spirit. That same gentle strength, same way of seeing past what others can't." They sat together as night faded into dawn, neither speaking much but finding comfort in shared silence. As the first light crept through the windows, Noel stirred. "Having you here," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "it's like watching the sun rise after the longest night, like light returning to a dark place." Amelia's heart swelled at his words. She squeezed his hand once more before rising to start the day's fire, understanding that something had shifted between them. In sharing his grief, Noel had given her his trust. And in accepting his pain, she had given him hope. The morning light grew stronger, chasing shadows from the corners of the cabin. A new day began, bringing with it the promise of healing, one small moment at a time. Spring crept across the land like a gentle awakening. Tender green shoots pushed through thawing earth, and morning birdsong filled the crisp air. As the days lengthened, Noel and Amelia found themselves spending more time outdoors, preparing for the season ahead. One bright morning, Noel walked the ground beside the cabin, measuring paces with his boots. Amelia watched from the porch, curious, as he marked a rectangle with wooden stakes. "Reckon this spot gets good sun," he said, driving the last stake into the soil. "Might be time to put in that garden you mentioned." Amelia's face lit up. She had been dreaming of growing vegetables since the first warm day. "Are you certain? I wouldn't want to take time from your other work." "Garden means fresh food come summer." Noel's practical tone couldn't hide his smile. "Besides, every proper home needs one." The word home settled warm in Amelia's chest. She followed him to the barn where he retrieved 2 shovels and a hoe. Together they began turning the earth, breaking up the winter-hardened soil. "My mama had a garden," Amelia said, pausing to wipe her brow. "Used to grow the sweetest tomatoes you ever tasted." Noel nodded, his strong arms making steady work of the ground. "Ayoka taught me about the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, how they help each other grow." "Will you show me?" Amelia asked softly, knowing how rarely he spoke of his late wife. "I'd like that." His voice was quiet but sure. They worked through the morning, shoulders brushing as they prepared the soil. By noon, they had a proper plot ready for planting. Noel brought out seed packets he'd been saving: peas, carrots, onions, and the 3 sisters. Amelia knelt in the fresh-turned earth, making careful rows with her fingers. Noel showed her how deep to plant each seed, their hands meeting in the warm soil. There was something sacred in the work, she thought, like a prayer made of action instead of words. The next day brought news of a different kind of planting. The traveling preacher, Reverend Thomas, arrived with plans for a permanent chapel. The community had been meeting under canvas tarps or in larger homes, but now they aimed to build something lasting. "We've got the land," the Reverend announced to the gathered families. "What we need now is willing hands." Noel stood at the back of the crowd, his height making him visible above others. Amelia watched his face as neighbors volunteered lumber, nails, and labor. She saw the moment he made his decision. "I can help with the sawing," he said, his deep voice carrying. "Got experience with beamwork, too." Heads turned, some surprised to hear him speak up, but the Reverend smiled broadly. "Much obliged, Brother Boone. The Lord welcomes all hands to his work." The building site buzzed with activity as families came together. Women set up cooking stations, children carried water, and men began marking foundation lines. Amelia joined the other wives at their outdoor kitchen, kneading dough for bread while watching Noel work. He moved with quiet confidence, showing younger men how to square lumber and measure true. What touched her most was seeing him work alongside several Apache men, his former brothers-in-law, she learned. They spoke little, but their movements flowed together with practiced ease. "Your man knows his business," Sarah Jensen commented, working beside Amelia at the makeshift table. "Town folk been wrong about him, I reckon." Amelia's heart warmed at the words "your man," though she didn't correct the assumption. "He's got a good heart," she said simply. "Most folks just never took time to see it." The morning sun climbed higher as work continued. Amelia carried water to the workers, pausing to watch Noel guide a beam into place. Sweat darkened his shirt and sawdust clung to his arms, but his face held a peace she rarely saw. The sound of hoofbeats drew attention. Silas Ketchum rode up on his fine bay stallion, taking in the scene with obvious disdain. His eyes found Amelia first, then narrowed at the sight of Noel among the workers. "Well, ain't this touching," he called out, his voice carrying across the site. "Building a house of worship with stolen property." Noel's shoulders tensed. Amelia saw his hands tighten on the saw handle, knuckles whitening. "Nothing stolen here, Mr. Ketchum," Reverend Thomas said firmly. "Just God's people doing God's work." Silas sneered, adjusting his fancy vest. "False hope you're building. Law's still law, and contracts still bind. Some folks here ought to remember that." His eyes fixed meaningfully on Amelia. She lifted her chin, refusing to look away, though her heart pounded. Noel took a step forward, but she touched his arm gently. "The Lord sees all contracts, Mr. Ketchum," she said clearly, "including those made in good faith." Something dangerous flickered in Silas's eyes, but he merely tipped his hat with mocking politeness and rode away. The tension he left behind dissipated slowly, like storm clouds breaking apart. Work resumed, though conversations were quieter. Amelia stayed close to Noel, watching his controlled movements as he returned to sawing. His restraint touched her deeply. She knew how much it cost him to hold his peace. The sun was setting when they finally headed home, both tired but satisfied with the day's progress. Their horses walked side by side along the familiar trail, hooves raising small puffs of dust. "Thank you," Noel said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. "For what?" "For encouraging me to help with the chapel. Been too long since I worked alongside others." He paused, considering his words. "After Ayoka died, it was easier to keep to myself. Didn't have to see the judgment in folks' eyes that way." Amelia's throat tightened with emotion. "You've nothing to be judged for, Noel." "Maybe not, but it's different now having you there. Makes me want to try again somehow." The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. "I'm glad," she said softly. "This place, these people, it feels right, being part of it all." "You've made a place for yourself here," he agreed. "Folks respect you." "They're beginning to respect you too," she pointed out. "They see what I see, a good man doing his best." Noel ducked his head, unused to praise, but Amelia caught the pleased curve of his mouth in the fading light. Sunday brought the first service at the half-built chapel, though the walls were only partially raised and the roof was still just bare beams against the sky. The space already felt holy. Rough benches held the congregation, while spring breeze carried their hymns heavenward. Reverend Thomas stood before the gathered families, his Bible open in his weathered hands. "The Lord says where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, There he is also. Today we are many more than that, joined in purpose and faith. His eyes swept the congregation, including everyone, settlers and Apache alike. This chapel rises not just by our hands, but by our unity. Every beam, every nail, every prayer offered here builds something greater than ourselves. After the service, the women laid out a feast on plank tables. Bread was broken, stories shared, and laughter mingled with the spring wind. Amelia found herself beside Noel, passing dishes and accepting compliments on her contribution to the meal. Under the tablecloth, hidden from curious eyes, Noel's hand found hers. His rough palm covered her fingers, warm and sure. Amelia's heart jumped at the touch, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand to lace her fingers through his, accepting the unspoken gesture for what it was: trust, comfort, and something more. The ride home that evening felt different. They traveled the same trail they always did, but Amelia's world had shifted somehow. Every glance at Noel's profile, every steady step of their horses seemed to carry new meaning. She found herself studying him in the golden light, the strong line of his jaw, the way his scar caught the setting sun, the gentle way he handled the reins. The thought that had been growing in her heart could no longer be denied. She was falling in love with him. This wasn't the frightened gratitude of their first days together, or even the warm friendship that had grown between them. This was deeper, truer, a feeling as natural as the changing seasons, as steady as the chapel's rising walls. Amelia kept this revelation private, holding it close like a precious seed. Like their garden, she thought, some things needed time to grow into their full beauty. For now, it was enough to ride beside him in the gathering dusk, their shadows merging on the trail home. Autumn painted the hills in shades of amber and gold, the morning air crisp with the promise of winter to come. Noel watched Amelia adjust her shawl against the chill as they prepared for their day's venture. He'd been teaching her survival skills gradually, but today would be different. Today was about hunting. "You sure about this?" he asked, checking the rifle one final time before handing it to her. "Nobody's forcing you." Amelia took the weapon carefully, remembering his lessons about keeping the barrel pointed down. "I need to learn," she said firmly. "Can't rely on you for everything forever." Something flickered in Noel's eyes at the word forever, but he simply nodded and helped her mount up. Their horses picked their way carefully up the winding trail into the hills, hooves crunching on fallen leaves. The morning sun cast long shadows through the trees, and their breath made small clouds in the cool air. "Tracks fresh," Noel said after an hour, pointing to marks in the soft earth. "Deer passed through not long ago. See how the edges are still sharp?" Amelia leaned down from her saddle, studying the prints with interest. "Which way did it go?" "Notice how the leaves are disturbed?" Noel gestured ahead. "It's heading toward the stream, probably for morning water." They dismounted and secured their horses, continuing on foot. Noel moved with the silence of his scout days, showing Amelia how to place her feet to avoid twigs and dry leaves. The forest was quiet, except for occasional birdsong and the whisper of wind through bare branches. "There," Noel whispered, touching her arm lightly. Through the trees, about 60 yards away, a young buck stood drinking from the stream. Sunlight dappled its brown coat, and its ears twitched alertly at every sound. "Remember what I taught you," Noel murmured, helping Amelia position the rifle. "Breathe steady. Line up the sights. Squeeze. Don't pull." Amelia raised the weapon, trying to keep her hands from shaking. The buck's chest was in her sights, just as Noel had shown her. One shot would mean meat for winter, proof she could provide. But as her finger touched the trigger, she saw the creature's gentle eyes, the peaceful way it moved. The rifle lowered slowly. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Noel, I just can't." Instead of disappointment, she saw understanding in his scarred face. "No shame and mercy," he said quietly. "Here, step back." He took the rifle, sighted quickly, and fired. The shot echoed through the hills. The buck dropped cleanly, without suffering. "Strength isn't just in pulling triggers," Noel told her as they approached the fallen deer. "Sometimes it's in knowing what you can and can't do. That's wisdom." They worked together to dress the deer, Noel teaching her the proper way to preserve as much meat as possible. Though the blood made her queasy, Amelia helped, determined to learn every aspect of frontier life. The sun was low when they finally returned to the cabin, the wrapped meat secured behind their saddles. While Noel took care of the horses, Amelia built up the fire and began preparing what they needed for roasting venison. The cabin filled with savory smells as the meat cooked. Amelia moved around the kitchen, adding herbs she'd dried over summer, while Noel cleaned his rifle at the table. The familiar routine felt comfortable, domestic. "You're getting better with cooking," Noel commented, glancing up from his work. "Long way from those first burned biscuits." Amelia laughed softly. "Lord knows those were terrible, but I keep thinking about teaching children someday. Can't very well do that if I can't feed them proper." The cleaning cloth paused in Noel's hand. "Children?" "Well, yes," Amelia busied herself with the cooking pot, suddenly shy. "I always wanted to teach. Not just reading and figures, but about God's love, about mercy. Like today with the deer. There's learning in knowing when not to shoot, isn't there?" Noel was quiet so long that Amelia finally turned to look at him. His face held an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between longing and fear. "Could you," he started, then seemed to gather his courage. "Could you ever love a man marked by war? Someone carrying scars both seen and unseen?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Amelia's heart beat faster as she met his gaze steadily. "Scars are part of strength," she said softly. "They show what we've survived, what we've learned. Like you said about mercy, sometimes strength is in knowing our hearts." Color rose in Noel's cheeks, but he didn't look away. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken things. Finally, Amelia turned back to the cooking, her own cheeks warm. "Supper's nearly ready," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. They ate by lamplight, the venison tender and flavorful. Afterward, while Noel returned to cleaning his rifle, Amelia sat near the fire to braid her hair for the night. The familiar motions were soothing, and she hummed softly as she worked. "That hymn," Noel said suddenly. "Ayoka used to hum something similar." "Does it pain you to hear it?" Amelia asked gently. "No," he replied after a moment, "not anymore. Reminds me there's beauty still in the world, even after loss." The cabin felt warm, and not just from the fire. Something had shifted between them, like earth after spring thaw. When they finished their evening tasks, they sat together at the table, drinking the last of the coffee. Noel's hand moved across the wooden surface, coming to rest briefly over Amelia's. His palm was rough from work, but warm, and his touch was gentle. Amelia didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand under his, letting their fingers link together. They sat that way for a long moment, saying nothing, while the fire crackled and autumn wind sang outside. The simple touch spoke volumes, of trust built slowly, of hearts healing, of possibilities neither had dared hope for before. When they finally parted for sleep, the cabin felt full of unspoken warmth, like sunlight trapped in amber. Amelia curled under her quilt, listening to Noel bank the fire for the night, and smiled in the darkness. Perhaps some lessons, she thought, were best learned not through teaching but through living. The chapel stood complete against the pale winter sky, its fresh-hewn logs gleaming in the crisp morning light. Wooden chimes, crafted by the Apache families, tinkled softly in the breeze. Smoke curled from the small stovepipe, promising warmth inside for the gathering congregation. Amelia's hands trembled as she smoothed her best dress, the blue cotton one she'd carefully mended and pressed the night before. She stood behind the chapel with Sarah, one of the settler women who had become a dear friend over the months of building. "You're sure about this?" Sarah asked, adjusting the small bouquet of dried wildflowers in Amelia's hands. "Not that anyone doubts your choice anymore, but it's still mighty quick." "My heart knows," Amelia replied softly. "The Lord has shown me his path." Inside the chapel, the congregation settled onto rough-hewn benches. The traveling preacher, Reverend Matthews, stood at the simple altar. Really just a sturdy table draped with a clean white cloth. Noel waited there too, wearing his cleanest shirt and looking more nervous than Amelia had ever seen him. The door creaked open, letting in a blast of cold air as the last few townspeople hurried inside. Whispers rippled through the gathering when they realized what was about to happen. This was meant to be just the chapel dedication after all. No one had expected a wedding. Sarah squeezed Amelia's hand one last time, then slipped inside to join the others. Amelia took a deep breath, touched the small cross at her throat, and stepped through the door. The chapel fell silent. Sunlight streamed through the simple windows, catching the dust motes in golden beams. Amelia walked slowly down the center aisle, her heart pounding. She kept her eyes on Noel, drawing strength from his steady gaze. Some folks still whispered about her being bought, about Noel's past with Ahyoka, about the speed of it all. But as Amelia passed each row, she saw more smiles than frowns. These people had worked alongside them, shared meals, witnessed their growing love over the months of building this holy place together. When she reached the altar, Noel held out his hand. His fingers were rough from work, but gentle as they closed around hers. Together, they turned to face Reverend Matthews. "Friends and neighbors," the preacher began, his voice warm and clear. "We gather today not only to dedicate this house of worship, but to witness an unexpected blessing. Noel Boone and Amelia May stand before us seeking God's blessing on their union." He paused, looking out over the congregation. Some might question the timing or circumstances that brought these two together. But I have watched them these past months. I have seen how they support each other, how they bring out the best in one another. Their love has grown naturally, like a seed planted in good soil. Amelia felt Noel's hand tighten around hers. When she glanced up, she saw moisture in his eyes, something she'd never witnessed before. "Noel," Reverend Matthews continued, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To protect and cherish her? To remain faithful to her alone? To walk beside her in God's grace until death parts you?" Noel's voice was rough with emotion, but clear. "I do." "Amelia, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To honor and support him? To remain faithful to him alone? To walk beside him in God's grace until death parts you?" "I do," Amelia said softly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The preacher lifted his hands over them. "Then by the authority vested in me and before these witnesses, I pronounce you husband and wife." He placed one hand on Noel's shoulder and one on Amelia's. "Lord God, bless this union. Let their love grow stronger with each passing season. Guide their steps, guard their hearts, and grant them joy in their journey together." "Amen." "Amen," the congregation echoed. Noel and Amelia turned to face their neighbors. Amelia beamed, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Beside her, Noel quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Several of the Apache families came forward first, offering traditional blessings in their language. Then other settlers followed, with handshakes and hugs. The dedication service continued afterward, with hymns and prayers blessing the new chapel. Amelia barely heard the words, too aware of Noel's presence beside her, of the new ring on her finger, a simple silver band he'd somehow acquired without her knowing. As the winter sun began to set, they mounted their horses for the ride home. The congregation waved from the chapel steps, calling out good wishes. Snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting their shoulders as they rode. The cabin windows glowed with welcome when they arrived. Noel had banked the fire well that morning, and warmth greeted them as they stepped inside. Everything looked different somehow. The familiar furniture, the cooking pots, the quilts, as if the simple act of marriage had transformed their home. Noel built up the fire while Amelia hung their coats. When she turned around, he was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Come here," he said softly, holding out his hand. She went to him and he drew her close by the hearth. For a long moment they simply stood together, listening to the fire crackle and the wind whisper outside. Then Noel tilted her chin up gently. "May I kiss my wife?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Amelia nodded, her heart fluttering. Noel's lips met hers with infinite tenderness. There was no demand in the kiss, no hunger, only reverence and love so deep it brought tears to her eyes. When they parted, Amelia rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. They sat together by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his shoulder. Neither felt the need to speak. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken joy. Later, as the fire burned low, Amelia rose to tidy the bed, smoothing the quilt that had once belonged to Ahyoka. She understood now that it wasn't just a covering. It was a symbol of healing, of love that could grow again after loss. Noel remained by the fire, giving her space. His respect for her innocence, his patience in all things, made her love him even more. As she changed into her nightdress behind the privacy screen, Amelia whispered a prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," she murmured, "for redeeming what seemed lost, for turning my father's cruel bargain into this blessed gift." When she emerged, Noel was banking the fire for the night. He looked up at her, his scarred face softened in the fading light. "Ready for me to put out the lamp?" he asked gently. Amelia nodded, slipping under the quilt. Noel extinguished the flame, leaving only the fire's glow. As darkness settled over their home, Amelia felt none of the fear that had haunted her first nights here. Instead, her heart was full of promise. Promise of mornings waking beside her husband, of children's laughter someday, of a life built on love freely given. The cabin creaked softly in the winter wind, but inside all was warm and still. Noel's breathing was steady nearby, and Amelia smiled in the darkness, knowing that God had indeed led her to where she belonged. Winter descended on the homestead like a thick blanket, muffling the world in white. The first real snow began falling just after sunrise one morning, coating the ground in crystalline powder. Amelia stood at the cabin window, watching the flakes drift down while she kneaded bread dough on the wooden counter. "Looks like we're in for a proper storm," Noel said, stamping his boots by the door. He had been out since dawn, checking on the livestock and securing the barn doors against the coming weather. "Will the animals be warm enough?" Amelia asked, dusting flour from her hands. "They'll be fine. Got fresh hay laid down thick in their stalls." He crossed to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. "But I reckon we'd best get used to staying close to home for a spell." The days grew shorter, darkness falling early and lingering late into the morning. Amelia found a rhythm to the winter hours, filling them with domestic tasks that needed doing. She sat in the wooden rocker by the fire, mending Noel's heavy work shirts and adding patches to worn places in their quilts. The steady motion of her needle was peaceful, and she often hummed hymns as she worked. In the evenings, she would read aloud from her Bible by lamplight, her voice soft but clear as she shared the familiar stories. Sometimes Noel would pause in his own tasks to listen, his expression thoughtful as the words filled their warm cabin. "Your voice makes even the hard parts sound gentle," he told her one night, after she finished reading about David's trials. Amelia smiled, touching the worn leather cover. "The words themselves are gentle if you listen with your heart." Outside, Noel spent hours chopping wood, building up their supply against the cold months ahead. Amelia would watch through the window as his axe rose and fell, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. When he came inside, she always had hot coffee waiting, and their fingers would brush as she passed him the cup. These small touches between them had become precious things, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair, her fingers straightening his collar before he went out to work, the way their knees would touch as they sat together at meals. Each gesture carried the weight of unspoken tenderness, of love growing deeper with each passing day. One evening, as Amelia stirred a pot of venison stew simmering on the stove, the cabin suddenly seemed to tilt around her. She gripped the counter, waiting for the dizziness to pass. The wooden spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floor. Noel looked up sharply from where he sat cleaning his rifle. "Amelia?" In 2 long strides, he was beside her, his arm steadying her waist. "What's wrong?" "I'm fine," she said, but her voice sounded faint even to her own ears. "Just got a bit lightheaded for a moment." "That's enough cooking for tonight." His tone brooked no argument as he guided her to their bed. "You're going to rest, and that's final." Amelia didn't protest as he helped her lie down, tucking quilts around her with gentle hands. He brought her a cup of water, watching with concern as she sipped it slowly. "Have you been feeling poorly?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "A little tired, perhaps." She hesitated, her cheeks warming. "And I've missed my monthly time." Noel went very still. "Missed it? You mean?" His voice trailed off, eyes widening as he studied her face. Amelia nodded, her heart fluttering. I think I might be with child." For a long moment, Noel didn't move. Then, slowly, he sank to his knees beside the bed. When he looked up at her, there were tears brightening his eyes, something she had seen only once before, on their wedding day. A baby? His voice was rough with emotion. He reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. Our baby? Yes, she whispered, her own eyes growing damp at the wonder in his face. Oh, Amelia. He pressed her hand to his chest where she could feel his heart pounding. I swear to you, I'll protect you both. You and our little one. You'll want for nothing, not while I draw breath. I know you will. She touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of his evening stubble beneath her fingers. No matter what storms come, he continued fiercely, no matter what troubles we face, I'll keep you safe, both of you. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the cabin like a wild thing. But inside, wrapped in quilts and her husband's love, Amelia felt nothing but warmth. Neither of them could sleep that night. They sat together in front of the fire, Noel's arm around her shoulders, listening to the storm rage beyond their walls. The flames cast dancing shadows as they talked softly of the future, of tiny fingers and first steps, of lullabies and cradles. I'll build the cradle myself, Noel said, his voice full of quiet joy. Out of good, strong oak. It'll last for all our children. All our children, Amelia smiled, nestling closer against his side. However many God blesses us with. He pressed a kiss to her temple, though right now this first one seems miracle enough. She placed her hand over her still flat stomach, wondering at the new life growing beneath her heart. Do you think it will be a boy or a girl? Doesn't matter to me, Noel said softly, long as they're healthy and strong like their mama. And brave like their papa, Amelia added, making him chuckle. The wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called into the night. Amelia felt Noel's arm tighten protectively around her. Spring will come before the baby, she mused. We'll have time to prepare. I'll make sure you have everything you need. His voice grew serious. I know it won't be easy, being so far from town when your time comes. But Sarah's a good midwife, and she's promised to stay with us when you're near your term. Amelia nodded, grateful for the older woman's friendship and experience. God will provide, she said simply. He's brought us this far. They fell silent then, watching the fire burn low. Every now and then, Noel would add another log, keeping the warmth steady against the winter night. Neither wanted to sleep, as if staying awake could somehow hold on to this precious moment longer, this first night of knowing about their child, of sharing their dreams for the future. The storm continued its wild song outside, but within the cabin walls, peace reigned. Their love, which had grown from such unlikely beginnings, now held the promise of new life. As Amelia finally dozed against Noel's shoulder, her last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude for the family they were becoming. Noel stayed awake a while longer, one hand resting protectively over Amelia's, both covering the place where their child grew. His scarred face was soft in the firelight, transformed by joy and wonder as he watched his sleeping wife and dreamed of the spring to come. The morning sun had barely touched the frost-covered window panes when hoofbeats approached the cabin. Noel rose from the breakfast table, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle before dropping away. Amelia set down her teacup, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. The deputy's knock echoed through their quiet home. When Noel opened the door, the man's discomfort was visible beneath his official bearing. He held out a folded paper, sealed with the county court's stamp. Sorry to disturb you folks, the deputy said, avoiding Noel's eyes, but I'm required to deliver this summons. You're to appear before Judge Harrison in town, 1 week from today. Noel took the paper, his face hardening as he read. Amelia watched the color drain from his knuckles as he gripped the document. Silas Ketchum, Noel said, his voice low and dangerous. He's filed a claim? The deputy nodded. Says he has a prior contract regarding the lady. Claims she was sold to him before. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Before my husband rescued me, Amelia finished quietly, coming to stand beside Noel. Ma'am, the deputy touched his hat respectfully. For what it's worth, most folks in town think Ketchum's gone too far this time. But the law's the law. Judge has to hear it. After the deputy rode away, Amelia's legs gave out. Noel caught her before she could fall, guiding her back to her chair. The morning sunshine seemed to mock their earlier happiness. "He won't take you," Noel said fiercely, kneeling before her. "I swear it, Amelia. We'll fight this." "The baby," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. What if they separate us before—" "No." Noel's voice was firm as he gathered her into his arms. "That won't happen. We have friends. We have proof of our marriage. God himself blessed our union in that chapel." Throughout the day, word spread across the scattered homesteads. By afternoon, neighbors began arriving. Sarah, the midwife, brought fresh bread and herbs for Amelia's morning sickness. The miller's wife arrived with preserves in righteous anger, declaring that no decent person would support Ketchum's claim. As dusk approached, 2 Apache women whom Amelia had met at worship gatherings came bearing dried meat and grim news. They spoke quietly with Noel in their language, but Amelia caught the concern in their tones. Later, as they prepared for bed, Noel told her what they had shared. "Ketchum's hired men are riding through the county, threatening anyone who might speak in our favor." "Surely the judge won't allow such intimidation," Amelia said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "Judge Harrison's honest enough," Noel replied, "but he's bound by the law. If Ketchum has papers—" He didn't finish the thought. Instead, he sat down heavily in his chair by the fire, pulling out his axe and whetstone. The sharp scraping filled the cabin as he worked the blade, his movements growing increasingly aggressive. Amelia watched him, recognizing the war within him, the same conflict she had glimpsed when they first met. Violence called to him, offering simple solutions. A sharp axe, a loaded gun, a dark night, the old way of settling scores. "Noel," she said softly, moving to stand beside him, "please, we must trust in God's justice, not man's weapons." His hand stilled on the axe. What if God's justice comes too late? What if Ketchum's money and influence win the day? Then we'll appeal. We'll fight with truth and faith, not force. She touched his shoulder. "Violence would only prove those who doubt you right. Show them instead the good man I know you to be." The axe trembled in his grip. Finally, he set it aside, pressing his face into his hands. "I can't lose you, Amelia. Not like." He couldn't speak Ahyoka's name, but it hung in the air between them. "You won't lose me," she promised, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. "We're stronger together than any paper Ketchum holds." The week passed with agonizing slowness. They continued their daily tasks, feeding livestock, cleaning, cooking, but everything felt hollow under the weight of waiting. Each night, they held each other closer, as if touch alone could ward off separation. More neighbors visited, bringing food and support. Even the traveling preacher arrived, offering to speak on their behalf about the sanctity of their marriage. Noel's Apache kin kept watch, reporting any movement of Ketchum's men. The night before they were to ride into town, Amelia couldn't sleep. She sat up in bed, watching Noel's troubled rest. The lamplight cast shadows across his scarred face, highlighting both its strength and vulnerability. Making a decision, she slipped from beneath the quilts and retrieved something from her sewing basket, a decorated leather cord she had been working on in secret, inspired by the beadwork she had found among Ahyoka's things. "Noel," she whispered, touching his shoulder. He woke instantly, years of frontier life having taught him alertness. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting up. "Nothing's wrong," she assured him. "I want to do something. Will you let me?" At his nod, she moved behind him, gathering his long, dark hair in her hands. With gentle fingers, she began separating it into sections. "Ahyoka used to braid your hair, didn't she?" Amelia asked softly. "I found her comb, saw the care she took with it." Noel's breath caught. Yes, he managed. She said a warrior's hair carried his strength, his honor. She was right. Amelia worked carefully, weaving the strands together. "You carry so much, my love. Sorrow and hope both. But you bear them with such grace." Tears slid silently down Noel's cheeks as she worked. When she finished, securing the braid with her decorated cord, he reached back to touch it. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely. They lay back down together, the lamp burning low. Neither spoke of tomorrow, of courts or claims or consequences. Instead, they held each other in the quiet darkness, listening to each other's heartbeats, feeling the miracle of their child, growing between them. Amelia pressed herself closer to Noel's chest, drawing comfort from his strength, even as she lent him her own. Outside, an owl called into the night, its cry lonely but unafraid. "Whatever comes," Noel murmured into her hair, "know that you saved me, Amelia. From the day you first stepped into this cabin, you brought light back into my world." "And you saved me," she answered, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "We'll face tomorrow together." The lamp flickered and dimmed, casting their shadows on the cabin walls. Two figures wrapped in an embrace, holding on to their fragile happiness against the coming storm. The courthouse buzzed with tension as townsfolk packed the wooden benches. Morning sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Amelia sat straight-backed in her simple dress, her Bible clutched tight against her stomach where their child grew. Silas Ketchum strode to the front, his boots clicking against the floor. He produced a sheaf of papers with a flourish, holding them high for all to see. "Your Honor," he declared, "I hold here a binding contract. The woman, Amelia May, was offered as collateral against her father's gambling debts. She is my rightful property." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. The door burst open and two deputies dragged Noel forward in chains, as if he were a common criminal. Amelia's heart clenched at the sight of her husband bound like a desperado. "Order," Judge Harrison commanded, his gavel cracking against wood. "Bring forward the witness." Amelia rose on trembling legs. As she passed Noel, their eyes met briefly. His contained both fury at his chains and pride in her strength. She took her place at the witness stand, laying one hand on the Bible. "Miss May?" Silas began, but Amelia cut him off. "Mrs. Boone," she corrected firmly. "I am Noel Boone's lawfully wedded wife." Silas's lip curled. "A marriage that cannot stand against prior claim. These papers." "As I chose Noel," Amelia declared, her voice carrying to every corner. "No man owns me. Not my father, not you, not even my husband. I am a free woman who gave my hand in marriage before God and witnesses." "Pretty words," Silas mocked, but the law—" Amelia reached into her pocket, withdrawing a carefully folded document. "Speaking of law, Your Honor, I have here a deed." She held it out. "Given to me by the family of Noel's first wife, Ayoka. It shows that the land Mr. Ketchum claims as collateral was never his to claim. The tract belonged to Ayoka's people long before Mr. Ketchum arrived." Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge took the deed, examining it closely. Silas's face turned purple with rage. "I will require time to review these documents properly," Judge Harrison announced. "Court will reconvene tomorrow morning. Mr. Boone will remain in custody until then for his own protection." "This is outrageous," Silas slammed his fist on the rail before storming from the courthouse. As the deputies led Noel away, Widow Chen approached Amelia. "You will stay with me tonight, dear," she said kindly. "It is not safe at the hotel." From the widow's spare room that evening, Amelia kept vigil at the window. The jailhouse lantern flickered in the growing dark, a tiny flame of hope. She whispered prayers into the night, one hand resting on her belly where their child grew. In his cell, Noel leaned against the rough wall. The tune came unbidden to his lips, the hymn Amelia had sung that first evening at the corral. Its melody carried him through the long hours, a reminder of her courage and their love. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when screams pierced the dawn. Amelia rushed to the widow's window, her heart stopping at the sight. Orange flames licked the sky where the chapel stood, black smoke billowing against the pale morning light. "Fire! The chapel's burning," voices shouted through the streets. Townsfolk poured from their homes carrying buckets and blankets. Amelia ran outside, her shawl clutched around her shoulders. Through the chaos, she saw Silas's men mounted on horseback, watching from a distance with cruel satisfaction. The newly built chapel, their symbol of hope and community, crackled and groaned. Flames devoured the fresh timber they had raised together with such joy. The heat pushed back the bucket brigade as they fought desperately to save the building. "Stand clear!" someone yelled as the roof timbers gave way with a thunderous crash. Sparks shot skyward like angry fireflies. Amelia fell to her knees in the dirt, tears streaming down her face. All their work, all their dreams, reduced to embers before her eyes. Heavy footsteps approached behind her. "Amelia, It was Noel's voice, rough with worry. Released on bond, he gathered her into his arms, heedless of the soot that blackened their clothes. Together they watched the chapel collapse, its beams glowing like fallen stars. When the flames finally died down, they joined others searching the ruins. The preacher stood among them, his face streaked with ash but his spirit unbroken. He placed a gentle hand on Amelia's shoulder. "The Lord's house isn't made of timber, child," he said softly. "It's built in hearts that love and hands that serve. No fire can destroy that truth." Noel's jaw tightened as he surveyed the destruction. "I won't let him break us," he vowed, pulling Amelia closer. "We'll rebuild stronger than before." That evening, back in Widow Chen's spare room, Amelia sat in the rocking chair, exhausted from the day's trauma. Suddenly, she felt it, the lightest flutter inside her belly, like a butterfly's wing. Her hand flew to the spot, tears springing fresh to her eyes. "Noel," she whispered. He knelt beside her chair, concern etched on his face. "The baby?" I felt it move. His rough hand covered hers, and though the movement was too slight for him to feel, his eyes shone with wonder. In that moment, the day's darkness lifted slightly. Their child, growing strong despite everything, reminded them that life persisted even in the ashes of destruction. "Like a flower pushing through scorched earth," Amelia murmured. "God shows us hope when we need it most." Noel kissed her forehead tenderly. "We'll rebuild," he promised. "Not just the chapel, but our whole community. Silas can burn our buildings, but he can't touch what matters most: our faith, our love, our future." The baby fluttered again as if in agreement. Amelia managed a small smile, remembering the preacher's words. Their true foundation wasn't in timber and nails, but in the bonds between hearts, bonds that grew stronger with every trial they faced together. Morning frost covered the courthouse steps as people gathered for the judge's ruling. Amelia gripped Noel's hand, her breath visible in the cold air. The judge, a weathered man with steel-gray hair, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "Having reviewed all evidence," he declared, his voice carrying through the packed room, "I find Silas Ketchum's claim void and without merit. The deed presented proves Noel Boone's clear ownership of the land in question. All charges against him are dismissed." Relief washed over Amelia like warm sunlight. Noel's shoulders straightened, years of tension falling away. But Silas's face twisted with rage. "This is corruption," he shouted, slamming his fist on the rail. "You'll regret this, all of you." He stormed toward the door, but townsfolk blocked his path, their faces hard with years of bottled anger. "We're done being afraid of you, Silas," Martha Jensen called out. Others nodded, murmuring agreement. The cattle baron pushed through them, his authority crumbling like dead leaves. That afternoon, wagons creaked up the hill to the chapel ruins. Apache families arrived with fresh-cut timber, while settlers brought tools and determination. Women set up cooking fires, and children carried stones for the new foundation. "We'll build it stronger this time," the preacher announced, directing workers, "with stone walls that won't burn." Noel worked alongside his Apache kin, lifting heavy beams while snow began to drift down. Amelia moved among the workers, serving hot coffee, her pregnancy now visible beneath her heavy shawl. Hymns rose from the working groups, voices blending in the crystal air. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," they sang, the melody carrying across the valley. Noel paused his work, watching Amelia as she rested one hand on her growing belly. Their eyes met across the busy site, sharing a moment of profound gratitude. That evening in their cabin's warmth, Noel did something Amelia had never seen. He knelt beside their bed, his voice rough with emotion. "Lord," he whispered, "thank you for sending her to me, for giving us justice, for showing me hope again." Tears slid down Amelia's cheeks as she listened, knowing that their trials had forged something unbreakable between them. A love tested by fire and made stronger for it. Spring painted the hills with wildflowers as ice melted from the streams. The rebuilt chapel rose proudly against blue skies, its fresh-cut timber gleaming in sunlight. When the bell rang, its clear voice carried farther than before, calling folks to worship from miles around. Amelia sat in her rocking chair on the cabin porch, her belly round and full beneath her apron. Bits of white fabric filled her lap as she stitched tiny gowns with careful fingers. The afternoon light caught the silver of her needle, flashing like hope. Noel's horse appeared on the trail laden with supplies from town. He dismounted carefully, carrying his parcels to her. Kneeling beside her chair, he lifted her work-worn hand and pressed it to his lips. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. Before she could answer, pain seized her. "The baby," she gasped. "It's time." Martha Jensen, their nearest neighbor and experienced midwife, arrived quickly. Through the night, Noel paced as Amelia labored, his prayers mixing with her cries. Near dawn, a new voice filled their cabin, their son's first powerful wail. Noel cradled the swaddled infant, tears streaming unchecked down his scarred cheeks. "You brought me back to life," he whispered to Amelia, who smiled tiredly from the bed. Days later, the chapel overflowed. Apache families sat beside settlers, all gathered to witness the baby's dedication. The preacher lifted the child, blessing him as symbol of new beginnings. That evening, lamplight warmed their cabin's walls while Amelia hummed sweet hymns. Noel rocked their son, his face peaceful at last, their home filled with the love that had redeemed them all. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.